Tokens. Tokens are a widely used Type 2 authentication mechanism. That is to say, something you have. These are small devices a user carries with them that have an associated unique identifier known to the authentication server. This allows for proof of possession at authentication time. They are typically used in conjunction with a Type 1 authentication factor, such as a password or PIN. Three categories of tokens are synchronous, asynchronous, and static tokens. Synchronous tokens, like the RSA Secure ID product, use a clock synchronized with the authentication server to produce authentication codes at regular intervals, such as every 60 seconds, codes whose sequence is unique to that device and hence user. When a user attempts to authenticate, they must provide the code corresponding to that time interval, or perhaps the one just before if the interval has just changed. Asynchronous tokens also produce authentication codes, but do so in response to specific events, such as in a challenge response protocol, where an authentication server gives the user a PIN that is input to the token in order to generate the authentication code. Static tokens, as their name implies, do not use changing codes, but instead have some form of static embedded identifier, such as data encoded on a magnetic strip or embedded in an RFID chip. Static tokens are typically used for local as opposed to remote access, but like their dynamic counterparts, are often used in conjunction with a Type 1 factor.